If you're ready, Bob, we'll get started, and people can trickle in as I do the intro. So hi, everyone. Welcome to the Harvard Brain Science Initiative's virtual book talks. It's a new series we're starting. And it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Robert Stickgold, who is a professor of psychiatry at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and Harvard Medical School, and the co-author of the new book, When Brains Dream, along with Antonio Zadra of the University of Montreal. Dr. Stickgold has over 100 scientific publications, many in top journals such as Science, Nature, Nature Neuroscience, and his work has received a great deal of public interest as well. There are stories about it in Time Magazine, in Newsweek, the New York Times, the Boston Globe. He's been invited to TV programs, the PBS NewsHour, Science Friday on NPR. He's given talks at museums, including the Boston Museum of Science. So we're really excited to have him. And just to give you a little background about his education, he did his undergraduate work at Harvard College, and then did his PhD studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Both places he received degrees in biochemistry. And he's done 2 postdocs. One was in neurochemistry at Stanford with Eric Shooter. And then he did a postdoc at Harvard in neurophysiology with Steve Kufler. Dr. Stickgold has been a pioneer in establishing the nature and the importance of sleep in offline memory processing. He's identified a number of memory types, a range of ones enhanced by sleep. His current work focuses on the nature and the function of sleep and dreams from a cognitive neuroscience perspective, with an emphasis on the role of sleep and dreams in memory consolidation and integration. In addition to typical functioning of sleep, he is interested in how there might be alterations in sleep-dependent memory consolidation in various brain conditions such as autism, schizophrenia, PTSD. And interestingly, in addition to the scientific writing, he has written 2 sci-fi novels. And yeah, we're really excited to have him with us today. I just wanted to say before we start that you can purchase his book, When Brains Dream, at the Harvard bookstore. I'm just going to drop the link in the chat if you'd like to take a look at that. During the talk, please feel free to write your questions in the chat box as you think of them. If you've submitted questions when registering, feel free to repeat them here. And at the end, you can raise your hand and we can have a video discussion session. So thank you so much for doing this, Dr. Stickgold.
You're welcome. I'm starting my timer so that maybe I'll be somewhere close to on time. Parzed, sorry, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be talking to this group, talk about my research and the book. And I'm going to do most of this in PowerPoint. So let's see if I can make this happen. Here we are. Okay, so official title for the talk is Sleep, Memory, and Dreams, a Unified Theory. I have a few disclosures to make about my own outside work and my wife's as well. But I want to start with a dream report that was told to me by a dear friend of mine, Barbara. She said, I was on the street where Stuart, her fiance, lived, and I was trying to find his apartment because I wanted to settle our not seeing each other anymore. And I couldn't remember why we weren't seeing each other. And whenever I thought I was at his apartment, I'd be somewhere else and have to go looking for it again. I kept wondering, whatever happened to Stuart? And when she awoke from this dream, she went into that sort of 1 or 2 second state of confusion where she asked herself again, what happened to Stuart? And then she remembered Stuart, who she was engaged to marry, had been over at her house for dinner when he had a massive heart attack and fell dead in her living room. Barbara told me this dream, and then she asked me, why did I have that dream? And that's what this talk is about. This talk is really about why we have the dreams we have, what our brain is trying to do through the process of dreaming. And I'm going to go through this in 3 steps. I'm going to start by talking about what's happening in the brain at a physiological and chemical level. Not much depth, not many slides, 5 minutes. And And then I'm going to spend a chunk of time talking about what we've learned over the last couple of decades about sleep's critical role in memory processing. Because when we turn to the rest of the talk about dreaming, it's going to be in relationship to this sleep-dependent memory processing. So let's get going. A good night's sleep is not a night of uniform sleep. We go through different stages of sleep in a 90-minute cyclic period known as the REM cycle. The night starts with a few minutes of stage 1, non-REM sleep called sleep onset. And then we go through a series of deepenings until we get into stage 4 sleep, also known as slow wave sleep. But after we get down there, after a very short while, we come back up. And we not only come back up to light non-REM sleep, but we go into our first REM period. REM meaning rapid eye movement sleep. REM sleep is the only sleep stage that has a band named after it, which is REM. So after you get to that first REM period, you cycle back down into deep sleep and back up. And as you can see, this 90-minute period continues pretty constantly in terms of length across the night. But most of that deep, slow wave sleep comes early in the night. Most of the REM sleep comes later in the night, at the end of the night, in fact. And then scattered throughout is this lighter stage 2 non-REM sleep. Now, what distinguishes these sleep stages from one another are several factors. One is the EEG, which looks fast in terms of its cycling in wake, slows way down when we get into light non-REM sleep, occasionally having these very slow waves. And then when we get into true deep sleep, stage 4 on this slide, that's what it used to be called, now it's called N3, you see these large, slow waves in brain activity. And here's the scale, 2 seconds. So these are lasting a second or two each in their oscillation. And then when you go into REM sleep, the EEG becomes very fast and desynchronized again. So you can see no pattern of activity at all. At the same time all of these changes are occurring, we're seeing eye movements. In that very light stage 1 sleep onset, you see slow rolling eye movements where the eyes are basically rolling back and forth every 2 or 3 seconds. In most of the non-REM sleep, you don't see any eye movements. And then of course in REM sleep, you see these bursts of rapid eye movements that can last several seconds. That's the second major physiological marker. The third one is muscle tone. As you would imagine, as you go from wakefulness into deep sleep, your muscles relax and your body becomes more and more relaxed. But unexpectedly, when you go into REM sleep, there's actually an active atonia. Your muscles are paralyzed and your body becomes unable to move, with the exception of your eyes, which can move around for rapid eye movements. Now, in addition to those changes, there are others that occur across the sleep cycle, wake sleep cycle as well. One is in the release of the levels of neuromodulators, including acetylcholine, norepinephrine, and serotonin, or 5-hydroxytryptamine. And these are probably most familiar to those who aren't intimately involved in this kind of work by the drugs that are used to interact with them. So acetylcholine is blocked by scopolamine or atropine, norepinephrine by the MAO inhibitors, and serotonin's effects are modulated by LSD or SSRI. So these modulators are being released at high rates during active wakefulness. As one approaches sleep, the rate of release decreases significantly. And then when you go into this deep slow wave sleep, deep non-REM sleep, what you see is a slight biasing of this system towards these monoamines, norepinephrine and serotonin, with acetylcholine release decreasing. But when you go into REM sleep, the whole thing flips on its head. Now the release of acetylcholine is higher really than any other time during wake or sleep, while the release of norepinephrine and serotonin is completely shut off. So the brain is shifting dramatically in its neuromodulations. And I like to think of this as changing the software that's running on the hardware of our brain. We also see changes in regional brain activity. During slow wave sleep, basically the whole brain quiets down. There's about a 20% decrease in glucose and oxygen consumption. But then when we come back up into REM sleep, we see increases in some areas, like the anterior cingulate, the amygdala, some association cortices. Much of the midline limbic system involved in emotions becomes hyperactive during REM sleep. While at the same time, other regions, and most notably this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, become even less active. And dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is involved in rational thinking, logical reasoning, impulse control. And all of these functions tend to be shut off during REM sleep. And if this strikes you as looking like a dream, that's sort of what it is. Dreams tend to be hyper emotional. They tend to be bizarre. They tend to be illogical. Impulse control seems to be absent. And that might just be due to this shifting of regional brain activation in this stage of sleep. We even see changes in the communication between brain regions. So during slow wave sleep, there's a lot of information flow out of the hippocampus and into the neocortex. While in REM sleep, the direction is reversed, with the information flowing into the hippocampus and not out. And this is important because it says that during REM sleep dreaming, the hippocampus being so heavily involved in the recall of recent memories, that with its outflow shut off, we don't have access to recent memories in their veridical form when we dream. And in fact, that's a constant of dream characteristics, that we in fact do not replay memories in dreams. We dream about what happened. We don't dream what happened. So that's it for the heavy science. I now want to shift to talking about sleep and memory evolution. I use the phrase memory evolution to describe the process or the processes that occur after a memory is initially formed. We used to talk about memory consolidation. We used to have this idea that in the first couple of hours after a memory was formed, it shifted from being in a labile state, where it can easily be interfered with, into a stable long-term memory. But it's now clear that our memories continue to evolve actually across our lifetime, with the content being modified, with the connections to other information being altered, with parts of it being lost, and with inaccurate information being added into it. And all of this is part of this process of memory evolution that the brain carries out to try to reconfigure memories to be optimally useful to us across our life. So here's an sleep-dependent memory learning. This is a task where subjects are asked to type the sequence 41324 over and over as fast as they can for 30 seconds. Then they rest for 30 seconds, do it again, and they do this for 12 minutes. And if you look at how well they do, well, it doesn't matter whether you train them in the morning or in the evening. They start out typing about 14 sequences correctly in that first 30 seconds. And then that number rises and rises until by the end, they're doing about 22, 23 sequences. And as you can see, it's pretty much plateaued by the end of this training. So what we do is we take these last two training trials and call that the level of post-training performance, send subjects away for 12 hours, bring them back, and have them do another 2 sequences. So what does it look like? Well, here's how they did on those last 2 sequences. The first time they learned it, 22 to 23 sequences, whether they train in the morning or the evening. The ones who trained in the morning, stayed up all day, and were tested in the evening showed no significant improvement. They were just less than 1 sequence faster, but again, it was not statistically significant. In contrast, the ones who were trained in the evening and slept overnight get 20% faster. So somehow, while you're sleeping, your brain is enhancing this memory so that you not only, in fact, type it faster the next morning, but you type it with fewer errors. So this kind of memory enhancement occurs while we sleep, but not during the day while we're awake. Now, that's a rather straightforward type of memory enhancement. You can imagine all the synapses involved in learning that typing sequence just were strengthened over the course of the night. But sleep can do much more complex calculations, much more complex evolution of memories. This is a task that Ina Jamajic, a postdoc in my lab, initially ran. In this task, subjects are shown 1, 2, or 3 of these 4 cards and asked to predict whether it's going to be sunny or rainy. And they do this for 200 trials. As you might imagine, they have no clue what I'm talking about when we start, but during these training trials, they get feedback. So in the first trial, they might see the diamond card, and then it turns out that the weather was sunny, and they basically tend to say, whatever. Maybe on the second trial, they see the circles and the triangles together, and this time it turns out to predict rain. Now, something fascinating about the human brain is that it's always building models, whether it wants to or not. So most of you are probably already doing that. You're saying, okay, the diamonds are sun, the circles and triangles are rain. I don't remember what the fourth one was. That's probably sunny too. And you start to build these models, and you're going to have 198 more trials to test it out. So along comes the third trial, and you say, okay, I've got this one. And then it turns out to be rain. And from this point on, subjects are baffled. They can't quite figure out what's happening. And that's because it's a probabilistic task. Each of the 4 cards has a certain probability of predicting rain when it appears. And they vary from 20% to 80%. And humans are very bad at figuring out probabilistic rules. In fact, none of our subjects at the end of the study could tell us what those rules were. It's a probabilistic task. So they train with 200 trials with feedback, and immediately after that, they get 100 trials without feedback, so we can see how well they've learned it. And in fact, on those 100 trials, subjects usually get 70, 80, even 90 of the 100 correct, doing every single subject doing significantly better than chance at understanding these rules. So we then send them away for 12 hours, as with the finger tapping task, either across the day or across the night. And if we do it across the day, when they come back, they get 1 or 2 more correct on that 100 trials. They get the exact same 100 trials. I'm sorry, I should have said that. The exact same 100 trials. And they get 1 or 2 more correct than they did at training. But if we send them away and bring them back after a night of sleep, they're actually 10% faster. Something happens while they're sleeping in their brain that allows them in the morning to better predict what those cards, in fact, predict. You can actually say with some legitimacy that when these subjects wake up in the morning, they understand how the world works better than they did when they went to bed the night before. And that's a critical function of sleep. Let me just show you one more example of a memory task or a learning task. This one was done by Jan Born's group. Uli Wagner was the lead author, a German group. In this study, subjects see sequences of 9 digits, 1s, 4s, and 9s, and are taught to process the sequence serially to come up with an answer. And the rule is that when they get the answer, they just press return to tell the computer that they were done with that one. They're told whether they were right or wrong, and they go on to the next one. So how does it work? Well, subjects are told that you can figure it out using 2 rules. The first rule is to take a pair of digits, for example, the initial 1, 1. And if they're the same, you just write that down as an intermediate answer. You then take that one with the next number, next digit, and if they're the same, you write it down again. But if they're different, you write down the 3rd missing digit, What does that mean? Well, there's only ones, fours, and nines. This is a 1 and a 4, so they write down a 9. And then they've got a 9 and a 4, so they write down 1. A 1 and a 9, they write down 4. A 4 and another 4, they're the same, so they just copy it again. And then 4 and 9 gives them 1, 1 and 4 gives them 9. They press spacebar and they go on to the next trial. But they're not told that there's a lot easier way to do this, because all these sequences are set up so that these last three answers, 4, 1, 9 in this case, will always be a mirror image of the three before it, 9, 1, 4, which of course means that this number here will be the same as the last one, meaning it's the answer. And so they really only have to process these first two steps before they hit the carriage return, confirmed that they got the right answer, and they can go on to the next one. Now, if they train subjects in the morning, well, first of all, regardless of whether that when they train them, a very small number, about 5 to 10%, actually figure out the shortcut during the 70 odd trials of training. Those subjects they take out back and shoot. The rest of them they send away for 12 hours, bring them back and test them again. So if they train them in the morning, keep them awake, and test them again that evening, just under a quarter of them end up discovering this pattern during the course of retesting. They can train them in the evening, keep them awake all night, and you get that same 25% or so figuring it out. But if they train them in the evening and let them get a good night's sleep, over 60% discover the pattern in the morning, 2.5 times as many as would have in the absence of sleep. So again, while people are sleeping, their brains are processing the information they took in so that in the morning, they can more readily discover this shortcut. So how does dreaming fit in with all of this? Well, Erin Walmsley in my lab ran the following study. She had subjects study a 3-dimensional maze, navigating their way through it, trying to learn the layout of the maze. And after a period of training, she would drop them into 3 different places and see how long it took them to find the single exit from the maze. They were trained in the evening and then retested with the same 3 starting locations the next morning. During the night, they were awakened for dream reports, several times in the sleep onset period, 2 or 3 times in the middle of the night from that light N2 non-REM sleep, and then one final dream report in the morning when they woke up, either from N2 or REM. And then after a half hour or so to make sure they were fully awake, she would do the testing. What she found is that in the subjects who had no dream reports related to the task, no improvement in performance was seen the next morning, whether you measured it by the time it took them to reach the exit or how far they had to travel to get to the exit. But if they had even one report that a judge scored as being related to the task, they showed marked improvement. So again, dreaming about it seems to enhance one's ability to perform this task. But it turns out that's probably not the case, because look at what they're reporting dreaming. I can see the maze, and I was thinking if I could swim above it, we could see everything. Okay, not very helpful. I was like standing in the middle of a maze waiting for my friend to find me. And I was waiting and waiting, and she just kept on going around calling my name. Or a third one, we were just like walking through it, but it was like a formal maze, one of those outdoor ones made out of hedges and bushes. It's clear that there's nothing in these dreams that the subjects are having that's going to help them perform the task better the next morning. Yet these are the people who are showing the marked improvement the next morning. So what's going on? Well, we need a new model of dreaming, a model that doesn't suggest that those dreams are helping us improve our memories the way they do during most of the night when we're not dreaming, in relationship, for example, to those examples I gave you earlier. And Tony Zadra and I, in our book, have come up with the acronym NEXT UP to define this new theory, and it's called Network Exploration to Understand Possibilities. Dreams are related to memories of recent waking events. This is pretty clear from decades of research. But they don't just replay these memories, like when you remember them during the day. Instead, they search for, discover, and then activate memories that are related, often weakly, often only bizarrely, to these waking events. And what dreams then do, Next Up proposes, is explore the usefulness of these newly identified associations. And when it finds those newly identified associations that are useful, it does so by weaving them into a dream, an emotional narrative with you, the dreamer, as the main character. And when it decides that a new association is useful, it literally strengthens physically the synaptic connections between your memory of the events from the day and this newly identified association, so that this new association will become available to you in your waking life down the road. This happens while you're dreaming, while you're having the dream, and doesn't require you to remember it in the morning. So the function is the same as it is for most sleep-dependent memory processing, which is to strengthen or extract information from recent memories. But most of that sleep-dependent processing is looking for answers. It's what we call convergent memory evolution, where we take these memories and try to come up with an answer. How do we better predict whether it's sunny or rainy? How do we better understand those sequences of numbers? How do we get faster at typing that 5-digit sequence? In contrast, dreaming is a classic case of divergent creativity, only seeking possibilities and not answers. So it starts from the memory and then looks out for related information, not trying to answer any particular question, just trying to say, this might be usefully related to the memory of the event from the day. This is the function of dreaming. It's network exploration to understand possibilities, to find these associated memories that might be useful to us in the future. Now, dreaming, it turns out, does not happen just in REM sleep. It happens throughout the night. And it's interesting that we know that different forms of memory processing occur in different sleep stages. That's what we've been doing in our lab for the last 20 years. So for example, that motor skills sequence is a visual discrimination task where you learn to identify the orientation of these three horizontal diagonal bars, whether it's a vertical column or a horizontal road, when this is flashed very quickly. We get better across sleep at remembering word pairs so that we're better able to remember that range goes with bath and brain with flower after a night of sleep than across a day awake. We're better at extracting and remembering words that represent the gist of a list of studied words. And we can learn to maintain memory of emotional objects in complex scenes and let our brain forget the rest of the background of that scene. Again, something that occurs when we sleep, but not while we're awake. And we can even get better at complex cognitive learning, like this Tower of Hanoi task, where subjects get better after a night of sleep. And for all of these kinds of learning, they happen in different sleep stages. So deep, slow wave sleep is associated with declarative memory, like learning word pairs. Non-REM stage 2 is involved in motor skill learning, like that finger tapping task. And REM sleep seems to be associated with more creative and complex processing, like extracting the emotional core of an emotional memory, or extracting and holding on to gist memory, or holding on to and discovering rules during the night. So we know that the brain already is processing different types of memories differently in these different sleep stages. And we also know that dreams differ in different sleep stages. So, as with slow wave sleep being involved in declarative memory consolidation, so dreams from non REM sleep, whether deep sleep or lighter non REM sleep, seem to have as their sources actual declarative memories. While REM sleep dreams tend to have more complex, associated, and older memories as their origin. So, for example, you might wake someone up from non-REM sleep who reports dreaming about flying saucers, and if you ask them, why do you think that was, she might laugh and say, oh, we had pizza for dinner last night. I'm sure it's the pizzas that made me dream of the flying saucers. Whereas a REM sleep dream about flying saucers, the person is more likely in the morning to say, oh, I love pizza. I just love pizza. So I'm sure that's why I was dreaming about it. So a more generic semantic memory as opposed to a detailed declarative memory, just like you see those different types of memories being processed differently in these sleep stages. But no one has talked about dreaming function differing between sleep stages. And so we do talk about this in the book, and we come up with the following proposal that sleep onset dreams, which tend to be very short, 10, 15 seconds, and to actually incorporate clearly events from the pre-sleep period, even the period immediately before falling asleep, that during that time the brain is identifying important issues from the day that are incomplete, that haven't been settled, and tagging those memories for subsequent processing later in the night. So that dream report, I can see the mazes, and I think if we could swim above it, we could see everything. That was a dream collected from sleep onset. She could see the maze. In contrast, non-REM seems to explore strong associations to that waking event. I was like standing in the middle of a maze, not the maze, but a maze, waiting for my friend to find me, waiting and waiting. And then in REM sleep, we think is when the brain is really exploring most distant associations, finding weak associations that you would literally never stumble upon when you're awake. And those during REM sleep lead to the dream reports, that are similarly bizarre and weakly associated. We were just walking through it, but it was like a formal maze, outdoors, made of hedges and bushes. So we think that's what's happening across the night. First, the brain tags the memories for later processing, both in dreams and in non-dreaming memory processing. That in terms of dreams, non-REM sleep explores strong associations, looking for those that might be relevant in subsequent waking, and REM sleep looks for more weak and distant associations. So dreams play a critical role in memory evolution, exploring novel associations to understand future possibilities. It's saying maybe it would be helpful to think about this issue in this novel way when trying to solve problems associated with it after waking. And different sleep stages are involved in different aspects of this function. But do we actually need to dream? That's probably the biggest question. And this is what we refer to as the hard problem of dreaming in relation to the hard problem of consciousness itself. Are we talking about dreaming being important, or its underlying biological processes? That is to say, do we, as Owen Flanagan has suggested, dream simply because evolution forgot to turn off our consciousness when we fall asleep, and the dreaming is just an epiphenomenon, unrelated to whatever the brain is trying to do? Or does dreaming, the conscious experience of dreaming, actually serve a function? And next up proposes that the brain does in fact need to dream. And here's why. You have to go back and look at the theories about consciousness itself. And I'm going to talk about work done by Antonio Damasio, published in his book, The Feeling of What Happens, some 20 years ago now. According to Damasio, consciousness is a gimmick that evolution chanced upon that gave organisms powerful new abilities. It gave the brain and the organism the ability to construct and experience narratives, stories, imagine scenarios, and to experience and evaluate feelings, in this case, associated with those narratives. And to do so in the context of an embodied self, that is to say, to have a conscious awareness that it's you having this dream and having these feelings. And together, these new capabilities gave organisms the ability to explore possible solutions to both new and old problems. This is what we do when we're awake and trying to solve a problem. We imagine what we might do, and then we look at our reaction to it. I got homework that's due tomorrow. My friends are going to a movie. Which should I do? So you imagine going to the movie, and you imagine having a lot of fun, and then you imagine being in trouble the next day for not having the homework done, and you end up not feeling good about it. And it's that emotional response, that feeling, that leads to your decision not to go to that movie. Quoting Damasio, consciousness provides a new means of solving different kinds of problems that we can't solve outside of consciousness. We actually have to imagine these in our conscious mind to solve these problems. It lets us create a world of imagination, a world of imaginary creations, the world of planning, the world of formulation of scenarios, and prediction of outcomes. This is what we do over and over when we're awake, as we plan our day, as we plan our life. And consciously experiencing the feelings generated in response to these narratives generates that evaluation of the scenarios, value to the individual. And Damasio convincingly argues that there's no other way that humans can achieve this function. But remember, this is when you're awake. A crucial function of sleep then is to discover and evaluate previously unexplored associations within our memory networks, ones which we would never notice when awake, to help us resolve current and even future concerns, to decide the value of these associations. And that requires both imagining these possibilities consciously in our minds and emotionally experiencing the outcomes of these imagined narratives, so we can decide whether these new associations are valuable and worth strengthening. And if the brain is going to do this, it needs consciousness. So to carry out this function in our sleep, we need to dream. And that turns out to be the function of dreaming. Thank you. So now I would be delighted to take questions. I will stop my screen sharing, and I look forward to all of your questions.
Thank you so much for that fantastic talk. People can feel free to raise their hands, type questions into the chat box. I wanted to get started with a kind of basic question, which I'm sure you get many times, but it's about remembering your dreams. What are the differences between, there's some people who remember it all the time and some people who say that they don't dream and they don't have any recollection.
So let me talk about two things. First of all, why some people remember and some don't. But then I want to talk about is it important to remember dreams or not? So don't let me forget that second point. So when someone comes to me and says, how come I never remember my dreams? My stock answer is, it's because you fall asleep quickly, you sleep soundly through the night, and you wake up with an alarm clock. And more often than not, they say, how did you know that? And the answer is that to remember your dreams, you have to awaken from them. And you have to awaken in a condition where you are able to lie for a minute without moving, without doing anything, preferably with your eyes closed, and think back to that dream. If you fall asleep quickly, you don't have that awareness of your sleep onset dreams. If you sleep soundly through the night, you're not waking up in the middle of the night when you might remember dreams. And if you wake up with an alarm clock, it really wipes your dream memory out instantly. I'm sure you all have this phenomenon that my wife constantly is having, where she'll wake up and turn to me and say, oh, Bob, oh, damn it. I had this whole memory, whole dream, and it's gone. So you really have to just lie there quietly for a minute. If you don't remember your dreams and you want to, all you need to do is drink 3 large glasses of water before you go to bed. And then you will wake up multiple times during the night, probably at the end of REM periods, because that's the easiest time for your brain to awaken you. And I promise you that you'll be remembering dreams. Does it make a difference whether you remember them or not? Well, not to the brain's biological function for dreaming. That evaluation of associations, that's identification of valuable associations and strengthening of those connections, all happens in real time while you're dreaming. But that doesn't mean that remembering your dreams can't be enjoyable or informative. You can think of remembering a dream as being similar to having a heartbeat. Your heart didn't evolve to make a sound as it pumps, but all pumps do that because they're moving fast. And so we can take that heartbeat and we can listen to it and we can extract information of value from it. So it's useful information even though we didn't evolve to have it. So we can do the same thing with dreams. And we have a whole chapter in the book on ways that you can take the dreams you do remember and use them profitably to understand yourself better.
Thank you so much. Larry, I think you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. That was really, really interesting. Sure. Just sort of for fun, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the work from Matt Wilson created, quite a stir some years ago about replay of maze neural activity in the hippocampus, which sort of looked like dreaming. Just curious to hear your thoughts about it. I really haven't followed where that went in terms of functional importance for improved consolidation. Mm-hmm. But yeah, just like to know.
So for those of you who don't know the studies he's referring to, Matt Wilson, who's at MIT, has done a huge number of very elegant studies recording from nerve cells, neurons in the hippocampus that are specifically activated when the rodent is in a particular place. So they're called place cells. And in fact, he can map 50 of these at the same time. And then as a rat or a mouse runs around in a maze, he can actually look at the activity of these neurons and know where they are with pretty high reliability as they're running around. And what Matt discovered was that, in fact, when the mouse goes to sleep, you see those nerve cells firing in the same pattern as they did when they were awake, as if the mouse was once again running in the maze. And I think Matt, on a couple of occasions, has suggested that he therefore knows what these mice are dreaming about. He hasn't said that in a publication. He said that in more popular press sources. What he, I think, more accurately has said is, if mice dream, I know what they're dreaming about, because the whole question of whether these mice and other animals are conscious is just a horrible conundrum that we haven't really come up with any way to sort out. But there's no question that that activity is related to that kind of memory processing that happens while we sleep and while mice sleep. And there's been more and more work showing that you can now experimentally reactivate patterns of brain activity in humans while they sleep, patterns that were similar to those while they were learning something before they went to bed, and indeed they end up with better memory for it after they wake up.
Thanks.
But we don't know whether that gets into their dreams. No one has looked at that.
Thanks.
It's really interesting. Thank you. So we have a question in the chat box from Gary Kaplan. Wonderful presentation. Thank you. How do hypnotic medications alter memory consolidation during sleep and the exploration of dream associations?
That's a great question. So it depends obviously on the hypnotic you're taking. In general, hypnotics tend to decrease both the amount of REM sleep you get and the amount of that deep slow wave sleep. So for some types of memory processing, it's clearly going to be detrimental. On the other hand, ironically, it can help other forms of consolidation. So if you remember that finger tapping task that I talked about at the beginning, the amount of improvement subjects show overnight tends to correlate with how much light non-REM sleep they get in the latter portions of the night. And it's been shown that if you give someone a hypnotic that actually diminishes the amount of REM sleep they get, well, that means they end up with more non-REM sleep late in the night, and they actually show more improvement overnight in the task than people not taking the medication. But the flip side of that is that all the forms of memory processing that depend on REM sleep, the ones involved with pattern extraction and insight and emotional processing, those will be diminished. What we know happens in both humans and in rodents is that if you train people on one particular task before they go to bed, their brain will adjust the amount of sleep they get in the different sleep stages to increase the amount of sleep for those stages relevant to what the subject or the rodent learned before going to sleep. And so anything that biases the brain one way or another is going to end up being detrimental overall to that memory processing at night.
Thank you. So we have some more questions popping up. So from Trent, are there any cases of people who are unable to dream while still progressing through the normal sleep cycle?
You know, there's a little bit of an argument about that. First of all, there are people with severe brain damage. Most of the examples are shrapnel wounds down near the midbrain who lose REM sleep. But they probably still dream. The cases of people not dreaming are those who have had frontal lobotomies. They tend not to at least remember any dreaming. And some other stroke victims that don't remember dreaming. But in the general population, if you take people who tell you that they never dream and you bring them into the sleep lab and wake them up from REM sleep, in almost every case, with just a couple of REM awakenings in the night, you'll get a dream report out of them. So are there people who go through all the stages normally? Yeah, probably the ones who've had frontal lobotomies, some stroke victims. And even in those cases, we can't be sure that it's not a recall problem. But I'll give them the benefit of the doubt and say that possibly they are unable to dream.
Thank you. So another question from Josh Sains. You said we don't know whether mice dream, but are there any ideas about whether other animals, for example, non-human primates, might dream?
First of all, hi, Josh. Nice to hear from you. The problem with asking about dreaming is the problem of asking about consciousness. I often confuse my students by explained to them that there have been no scientific experiments that have demonstrated that humans are conscious. That's true. All we've ever done is start from the assumption that humans are conscious, obviously a legitimate starting point, but not a scientific one, an introspective one. And then based on that assumption, talk about who's conscious and who's not. We don't have any way of identifying whether a human is conscious or not, unless they obviously are conscious. But even with people who are in comas now, there's a lot of discussion going on about whether they are conscious or minimally conscious or conscious at all. And we don't know any biological markers for consciousness, either in these chronic clinical conditions or in just everyday people. So lacking those markers, we don't know how to go to primates or rodents and ask whether they're conscious or not. They certainly act like they are. And if they are, it's probably reasonable to assume that they dream because they're showing the same brain activity as we expect to see in organisms that are dreaming. But again, they might just be doing offline memory processing without dream content. If you have any ideas about how to collect dream reports from your primates, I'm all ears.
That's a really interesting topic. I had a question that I might not be able to explain perfectly, but I'm going to give it a shot. So for the next up model, when you were talking about the idea that the brain is exploring associations, both strong and weak, depending on the stage that you're at, between different memories and experiences, I was trying to figure out this idea of usefulness, that associations that are useful might be worth strengthening. I was trying to figure out, you were talking about imagining outcomes and seeing if something was helpful, but it seems like the state that you're in when you're dreaming is bizarre and not the state that you're in would be thinking when you're awake.
Yes.
So if you could comment on that and explore what that means and like what the biological meaning might be, what's happening when something is useful or not useful.
Sure. So one thing you probably know, if you remember many dreams, is most of your dreams per se seem profoundly useless. They're often irrelevant, it seems, to anything in your life. They're often so bizarre you have no idea what they're related to. And even if you know what they're related to, it doesn't seem like it's telling you anything particularly useful. Sometimes you'll have these big dreams where you wake up in the morning and you say, oh my God, that explains, now I understand something. But by and large, that's not what's happening. So what we think is going on is that the brain is just looking at the dreamer's emotional response within the dream to the narrative. And if that emotional response is strong, either positive or negative, it defines that as meaning that it's useful. We have emotions when important things happen, things that we want to learn about, things that we want to remember, things that we want to understand. And so the idea is that the brain is just looking at the level of affective reaction to the dream. And if that level is high, it then strengthens the connection between the ongoing concern, the waking source of that memory or that waking memory, and this newly discovered one, and strengthens the connections between them. And then leaves it for you when you wake up, even though you don't remember the dream, to have that new association available to you in trying to continue to work on the problem you had when you went to bed.
Thank you. That helps. So I'm going to see that we have a bunch of new questions in the chat. So let's see. Do dreams relate to what we encounter closer to bedtime more than they do to what we encounter earlier in the day?
Well, that answer varies as you go across the night. When you first are falling asleep, even before you fall asleep, when all those thoughts are going through your mind as you're trying to fall asleep, those will be biased first and foremost towards things happening close to bedtime, and then towards things that were emotional from other parts of the day. But there's a strong predilection towards those sleep onset hypnagogic dreams, as they're called, being related to things happening late in your day. As you go through the night, that shifts. So your non-REM dreams, and remember, most of your non-REM sleep comes early in the night, most of your REM sleep late. Your non-REM dreams tend to be more about recent events, where if you ask subjects to identify the waking sources of the dreams, they'll point to events that happen usually in that day or a day or two before it. But by the time you get into REM sleep later in the night, it seems to be largely um, partially related to events from the day, but more strongly related even to older events that can come from days, months, or even years earlier. So there's sort of a progression across the night in the sources for those dreams.
It's really interesting. So another question, anecdotally, singers and choirs who are working on difficult music improve after waiting a day or two after the rehearsal. Could this be happening during their sleep?
I would predict that it does. I would predict that if we had a good way of testing them, we would see improvement across the first night, no improvement about during that day, and then possibly some more improvement the next night. On the finger tapping task that I started out with, we know that across 12 hours awake, immediately after training, you see no improvement. Across the night then, whether they initially trained in the morning or the evening, they'll get about 20% faster. They'll show no improvement across the next day, and they'll get an additional bump the second night and possibly even the third night. But if they get no sleep the first night, they show no improvement, and subsequent nights can't make up for the missed night. So I would predict that the answer is absolutely. It's happening while you sleep. And if you stay up all night, you'll lose the chance for that improvement, even from a second night.
Since you were talking about the finger tapping task, someone just asked, Trent, in the finger tapping task, does a nap cause any improvement within a single day?
Yes. And it causes as much improvement as a whole night. And that's kind of confusing to us, because we know on that task or similar tasks that you can get as much improvement over a 90-minute nap as you do over an 8-hour night. But in some cases, 6 hours of sleep during the night gives you no improvement at all. So naps seem to be sleep-dependent consolidation and evolution on steroids. It seems to go faster and more powerfully than when we're awake. And in fact, I mentioned that you can get more improvement on a second night. If you take a nap, you can get a whole night's worth of improvement. And then in the first night, you can get as much improvement as you normally get on that second night.
Thank you. So related to that question, Bill is asking, are there any benefits or improvements in memory in cultures where there are siestas and nap culture?
I'm sure there are. No one has looked at it. But when we look at naps, we find them powerfully helpful in enhancing those memories. And in doing so, it does not take away from the next night's improvement. Interestingly, with young kids, with infants who are taught artificial grammars in these studies, if they don't get a nap within a couple of hours after learning it, they don't benefit. If they get a nap, they do benefit. And the ones who don't nap don't benefit from a subsequent night of sleep. So it might be that part of the reason young children have to nap is because their brain can't maintain their newly acquired information in that state where it can be processed during sleep long enough to last across a whole day.
Thank you. So we have a question from Sophie, which I think you touched upon a little bit. I wanted to ask because I think there's a lot of interest just in general about this idea of remembering dreams. So she asked, what individual differences might influence how well someone remembers or doesn't remember their dreams? You know, are there things beyond what you already shared about what the alarm clock and when they wake up?
Right. There's good evidence that if you look sort of at sort of home diary recording of dreams, that people who are more constricted in their personality tend to have poor dream recall. That those people who have what Ernest Hartman has called weak boundaries tend to have much better self-reported dream recall than those who have thick boundaries, those who tend to have more rigid frameworks psychologically in their lives. And whether that has to do with what they do when they wake up, whether they do tend to wake up with alarm clocks. We developed a device for home sleep monitoring and collected dream reports from some of the engineers involved in the design and development of it, and got almost nothing. And you would see it in these dream reports that would say, oh man, there's this huge battle going on and there are people getting killed everywhere. End of report. You know, it's just these short reports and you want to say, come on, guy, there was a lot more there. But the reports also tend to be very short. But just on whether they report remembering anything or not, you also see much less self-reported dreaming in engineers than in artists, for example.
Thank you. So then another question about individual differences in the dreaming experience from Hillel. If people are different from each other in the duration of their sleep stages, does it mean that they differ inherently in some of their skills, such as long REM and creativity? Could it predict these skills in a general manner?
I don't think anyone has actually done that study. It could. But even if it did, it would be tricky. It might be that people who have more REM sleep have more REM sleep because they're more creative during the day, and the kind of thinking and learning that they're doing during the day is the type that would benefit from REM sleep, and hence their brain increases their REM sleep. Or it might be that people who just naturally, biologically, genetically have more REM sleep are therefore more successful at processing and learning from creative experiences during the day and turn into more creative people. We really don't have a way to tease that apart on the individual level yet.
Thank you. And when people were registering, I noticed that there were some questions about therapeutics that were interesting. So you had mentioned, not in this talk, but I think elsewhere, that you're interested in studying schizophrenia, autism, PTSD, you know, conditions where people, brain conditions where you think sleep might be altered. So that if you do find alterations, is there any potential for some kind of new intervention that would help these people, something beyond pharmaceuticals?
There are ways you can increase slow wave sleep, that deep non-REM sleep, literally by just wearing AirPods to bed and having them play tones at a low frequency of about 1 hertz, 1 per second, which is the same as the frequency of those slow waves in slow wave sleep. And studies have shown that when you play sounds at those frequencies, you actually increase the amount of slow wave sleep that people get, and you get enhancement in memory of those types of memory that depend on slow wave sleep. Again, you don't want to do this in a healthy population on a constant basis, because then you're biasing the brain to not have the flexibility that it wants. But as people get older, for example, they lose most of their slow wave sleep. And Matt Walker has shown that in the elderly, the best predictor of the decrease in memory with aging is not the age of the subject, but the amount of slow wave sleep they're getting. So in that population, it might be worth using interventions like these tones to increase their slow wave sleep. PTSD is another interesting example because I've published a couple of papers suggesting that PTSD might actually be a sleep defect, might actually be a consequence of impaired sleep-dependent memory processing. Because some of the kinds of processing that we see happening primarily or only in sleep are exactly the ones that you need to recover from trauma. So the ability to hold on to the emotional core of a memory, but let all the details be forgotten, critical for resolution of trauma, doesn't occur with PTSD, and depends on REM sleep in normal, healthy subjects. Similarly, other aspects of memory processing, the integration of new memories into existing networks. So one of the things you have to do to recover from a trauma is put it in perspective, to find those associations that help you to understand what happened. Oh, what happened to me now is like this that happened to this other person I know, or this similar but not the same thing that happened to me at another time. And again, this is something that PTSD sufferers fail. One of the things that's striking about these forms of memory processing in sleep that seem to be necessary for recovering from trauma is that they're all REM-dependent processes. And one of the unique features of PTSD is that they're the only people who, with any consistency, dream dreams that actually replay their waking memories. So when a normal person has an experience like being in a car accident, they might have dreams about being in bumper cars at an amusement park, or they might have dreams about being in a fight in a bar, some other situation that puts them at risk. And in this way, they seem to be able to imagine other scenarios where they survived, where they did well, or where they have to continue to be alert and worry about possible repetitions. But with people with schizophrenia, they literally replay the trauma memory in a veridical form. And we think that that's an indication that the brain is not able to do this kind of exploratory processing that's necessary to recover from the trauma. And the reason for that might be, you remember way back at the beginning of my talk, I commented that one of the characteristics of REM sleep is that you shut off the release of norepinephrine. It's the shutting off of norepinephrine that allows the brain to explore really distant associations in the brain. You know, when we're really cranked, when we're aroused, when we're hyper-focused, that's high levels of norepinephrine. And it tends to lock the brain into strong associations so you won't be distracted. Turns out people with PTSD fail to shut off the release of norepinephrine when they're in REM sleep. They're locked in a hypervigilant state, not only when they're awake, but when they're asleep. So it might be this inability to shut off norepinephrine at night that actually is the causal agent of the development of PTSD, with PTSD literally being nothing more than the failure to adequately process a trauma memory. And there are medications that have been used that can stop those repetitive dreams, and that also seem to help with the PTSD when you're awake.
Wow, that's really intriguing. Thank you. So I think we'll see if we have any final questions and then wrap it up. Any more last questions? If not, then I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Stickgold, for a really wonderful presentation and really wonderful answers. And also thank you to everyone who asked these really engaging, interesting questions. I just wanted to mention we are seeking ideas for other books. So if there are any neuroscience related books that you'd like to invite authors for, please let us know. And thank you again, Dr. Stickgold.
It's been a pleasure. Great questions all around.
Thanks, everyone.